The studio lights burned bright, cameras locked in on the two chairs facing each other like a political duel. Jessica Tarlov sat there with that signature smirk, the one she wore when she thought she had the upper hand. Across from her, Texas Governor Greg Abbott leaned forward slightly in his wheelchair, calm but with a sharpness in his eyes that said, "Go ahead, try me." The moderator had barely finished the introduction when Jessica pounced. "Governor Abbott," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "you've built your entire career on being a migrant enemy. You've turned human beings into political pawns. And frankly, it's disgraceful." A murmur rippled through the studio audience. The word enemy hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Abbott didn't flinch. His hands rested lightly on the armrests of his chair, but the intensity in his gaze was impossible to ignore. Jessica continued, emboldened by the reaction. "History will remember you not for leadership, but for cruelty. You've waged a war on people who came here seeking hope." She leaned back, crossing her arms, convinced she had cornered him. Abbott waited for the applause from Jessica's supporters to fade. Then he leaned toward the mic and spoke in a steady, deliberate voice. "Jessica, let's talk about cruelty. Cruelty is promising people a better life, knowing full well they'll be dumped into unsafe, overcrowded cities that can't care for them. Cruelty is virtue signaling about compassion while refusing to take responsibility for the chaos at our border." The crowd shifted. Some clapped, others booed. But Abbott wasn't done. He pulled out a printed quote, Jessica's own words from a year ago, where she had criticized her own party for failing to address illegal immigration. "Your words," he said, holding the paper toward her. "You called it a national security crisis." "That wasn't me talking, that was you." Jessica froze, her smirk faltering for the first time. The moderator tried to interject, but Abbott pressed on. "You want to lecture me on morality? Start by explaining why you changed your tune the moment it became politically convenient." The tension in the room was electric. Even through the cameras, viewers could feel the shift. Abbott had just flipped the narrative, and everyone knew it. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fingers curling around the edges of her notepad. "Governor," she said, forcing a laugh, "you're cherry-picking my words. Context matters." Abbott cut in smoothly, "Oh, context matters? Let's give the audience the full context then." He turned toward the camera, speaking directly to viewers at home as if inviting them into the confrontation. "Last year, Jessica Tarlov said, on national television, that ignoring illegal crossings was a dereliction of duty. She said politicians who do nothing are, and I quote, abandoning the American people. Now, I didn't write that. I didn't make it up. Those were her exact words." The screen behind them lit up with the quote, bold and unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the audience. Jessica's smile was gone now, her jaw tightened. Abbott leaned back, his voice calm but edged with steel. "So tell me, Jessica, was that statement true when you said it? Or have you decided to rewrite your beliefs because the cameras are rolling and the political winds have shifted?" Jessica tried to regain ground. "Governor Abbott, the difference is..." He didn't let her finish. "The difference," he said, leaning forward, "is that I'm consistent. I protect my state. You protect your talking points." The audience erupted, some clapping, others jeering. It was chaos, and the moderator struggled to restore order. Abbott simply waited, his eyes never leaving Jessica. She drew in a breath and tried again. "The truth is, you've turned Texas into a national embarrassment. Your stunts don't solve the problem, they inflame it." Abbott's reply was instant. "An embarrassment is watching Washington politicians, your friends, sit on their hands while border towns crumble. An embarrassment is having the power to act and choosing to lecture instead. If that's compassion to you, then we're living in two different realities." He turned to the crowd with a pointed question. "How many of you feel safer today than you did 5 years ago?" Hands went up, others stayed down. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of pause where the audience feels the weight of the question long after it's been asked. Jessica straightened her shoulders, trying to project control. Governor, you love to frame this as black and white, but the real world is complicated. Abbott didn't even blink. Complicated is a word people use when they don't want to admit they're wrong. The crowd stirred, some nodding, some booing. Jessica opened her mouth, but Abbott raised his hand, commanding the floor. You've been on record, he continued, supporting stronger border enforcement when it was politically convenient for you. You praised certain governors for taking action, until it was me. Then suddenly, it's inhumane, it's grandstanding. He leaned forward, his voice lowering, the kind of tone that forces everyone to lean in. So which is it, Jessica? Do you care about securing the border, or do you just care about attacking Greg Abbott? Jessica let out a sharp laugh, a clear deflection. Governor, if I wanted to just attack you, believe me, I could fill the entire hour. Go ahead, Abbott shot back instantly. But do it without dodging the question. The moderator looked trapped between the two, glancing at the control booth as if silently begging for a commercial break. But Abbott wasn't letting go. You say my actions are a stunt. You say transporting migrants to so-called sanctuary cities is wrong. Tell me, Jessica, where should they go? What's your plan? Because if your plan is just to criticize mine, then you don't have one. Jessica hesitated. Just a second. But in a debate like this, a second feels like an hour. Abbott saw it. The audience saw it. That pause right there, Abbott said, pointing toward her, is the sound of someone who doesn't have an answer. And Texas can't afford politicians who can't answer the simplest question. The crowd roared. Jessica's face flushed, she tried to interject, but Abbott's voice rose over her. You called me a border enemy last month, he said. But the truth is, I'm the one standing on the border while you stand in a studio. He turned toward the audience, piercing them with his gaze. Tell me, who's really the enemy? The person protecting your home, or the person protecting their political brand? The question hung in the air like a hammer waiting to drop. Jessica inhaled sharply, her voice rising as she went for the emotional punch. Governor Abbott, you talk about protecting homes, but what about the mothers and children being put on buses with no food, no water, no idea where they're going? You're treating human beings like political props. The audience reacted with a mix of applause and groans. Abbott didn't flinch, instead, a faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Political props, he echoed. Jessica, do you think the crisis just started when I decided to expose it? Those buses are going to cities that publicly declared they were ready to welcome them. You and your friends in those cities loved the sound of sanctuary, until you actually had to provide sanctuary. Jessica shook her head quickly, as if trying to wave away the point. You're twisting the issue. No, Abbott cut her off. I'm exposing it. There's a difference. And let me tell you something about those buses, at least those families are being sent somewhere safe, not left on the streets of border towns already overwhelmed and underfunded. That's what your so-called compassionate approach leads to. The moderator tried to interject, but Abbott kept going. You want to talk about compassion? Where was your compassion when Border Patrol agents were working 16-hour shifts in 110-degree heat, begging Washington for help? Where was it when cartel violence spilled over into small Texas towns? Jessica leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. So your solution is to turn desperate people into a spectacle? Abbott's eyes narrowed. No, my solution is to make the people who created this mess face the consequences of it. If you think that's a spectacle, then maybe you're more interested in optics than outcomes. The room erupted again, Abbott's supporters cheering, Jessica's allies groaning. Abbott glanced toward the crowd, locking eyes with the cameras as if speaking directly to millions watching at home. Folks, ask yourselves, would this debate even be happening if I hadn't forced the issue into the national spotlight? Or would Jessica and her friends still be pretending the border was just fine? Jessica opened her mouth, but her voice was drowned out by the wave of noise. Abbott had hit his stride, and it was clear he wasn't done yet. Jessica straightened in her chair, clearly trying to reclaim control. Her voice took on a sharper edge. You can dress this up however you want, Governor, but what you're really doing is fearmongering. You're using suffering to score political points, and deep down, you know it. Abbott tilted his head slightly, a slow grin forming. Fearmongering? Jessica, if telling the truth about the consequences of open border policy scares people, maybe it's because the reality is frightening. Jessica scoffed, glancing toward the moderator for backup, but Abbott didn't let her breathe. You call it fearmongering. I call it accountability. And I'll tell you something else, it's rich hearing you talk about political points when your own party tweets photo ops with migrants, smiling like they've solved the problem, while doing absolutely nothing to secure the border. The audience let out a mix of gasps and laughter. Jessica's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. The difference is, we believe in treating people with dignity. Abbott leaned forward, his tone calm but cutting. Dignity? You mean the kind where you encourage people to risk their lives crossing deserts and rivers, only to be met with overcrowded facilities, cartel exploitation, and dangerous city streets? That's not dignity, Jessica, that's negligence wrapped in a moral slogan. She opened her mouth, but Abbott raised a finger, silencing her. Let me ask you something. Have you been to Eagle Pass at 3 a.m.? Have you talked to the ranchers who find bodies on their land? Or are your ideas about the border all from a studio in Manhattan? The room erupted again, cheers from Abbott's side, a few scattered boos from Jessica's. The cameras caught her lips tightening into a thin line. She tried to interject, but Abbott pressed on, delivering the moment that would light up social media. You accuse me of lacking compassion, Jessica. But compassion without courage is just weakness in disguise. And I refuse to be weak when Texans' safety is on the line. There it was, the verbal strike that left Jessica momentarily speechless. The crowd's roar carried through the studio, and the moderator's voice was nearly drowned out trying to restore order. The moderator leaned in, clearly sensing the tension, and asked Jessica if she wanted to respond. She seized the moment, straightening her notes with a sharp flick. Governor Abbott, she began, her voice dripping with controlled disdain, Texans may buy your tough guy act, but the rest of America sees you for what you are, a man hiding behind border walls because he's too afraid to face the real issues. You're not protecting anyone. You're performing. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Abbott didn't flinch. Jessica leaned forward now, pressing her advantage. You talk about courage, but you target the powerless to look strong. You're not leading, you're bullying. For a split second, Abbott stayed silent. He let the words hang in the air, his eyes locked on hers. Then he spoke, his voice low, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. You think I'm performing? Jessica, this isn't Broadway. This is Texas. And in Texas, we don't confuse protecting our people with bullying. But you know what's interesting? You sit here calling me a coward, yet you wouldn't last 5 minutes on the front lines of the crisis you claim to understand. Jessica shifted in her chair, her smile tightening. Abbott continued, his tone sharpening, and here's something you might not want to hear, the so-called powerless you're defending? Many are being used as pawns by cartels that your policies empower. Every time you argue for looser borders, you're not standing up for the vulnerable. You're standing up for the criminals exploiting them. Gasps cut through the crowd. Jessica opened her mouth to interject, but Abbott wasn't done. You call me a bully, Jessica? Fine. But if defending Texans, enforcing the law, and refusing to let our communities be overrun makes me a bully in your book, then I'll wear that label with pride. Because unlike you, I answer to the people I serve, not the applause of a TV audience. The studio erupted, half the crowd cheering, the other half stunned into silence. Jessica's face froze for a moment, the flicker of uncertainty undeniable. And in that instant, it was clear, Abbott had just turned her accusation into his victory lap. The air in the studio felt heavier now, like a thunderstorm was just about to break. Jessica leaned forward in her chair, eyes narrowing, her voice dripping with sarcasm. So, Governor Abbott, tell me, when you bust those migrants halfway across the country, do you actually feel proud of yourself? Or do you just like the applause from your right-wing friends? Her words weren't just a jab, they were designed to paint Abbott as a cold, unfeeling politician. A few audience members gasped, others murmured in agreement, and the tension in the room spiked like a pressure cooker about to explode. Abbott didn't flinch. He adjusted his tie, glanced briefly toward the cameras, and then, ever so calmly, spoke. "Jessica, do you know what's actually cold? Leaving border towns completely overwhelmed while people like you sit in TV studios hundreds of miles away, pretending to care. You call me a migration enemy, but the truth is, I'm protecting both Texans and the very people you claim to defend." The audience shifted in their seats. Some nodded, others whispered. Jessica's smirk faltered, just slightly. Abbott continued, his voice gaining force. "You've never been to Eagle Pass when hundreds of people cross in one night. You've never stood with the families whose ranches have been destroyed. You've never looked into the eyes of a parent whose child died because cartel smugglers used them as pawns. But I have, Jessica. I've been there. And I've acted. Because speeches in studios don't fix crises. Decisions do." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras zoomed in, capturing Jessica's face. She was biting her lip, clearly weighing her next move. Abbott wasn't just answering, he was building a case brick by brick, and each brick was hitting her harder than the last. Then, with a quiet but razor-sharp tone, he added, "And by the way, those buses you mock? They're voluntary. Every person signs consent before boarding. We're giving them options, not orders. But facts like that, they don't make for good TV, do they?" The audience erupted, some in applause, others in shocked gasps. Jessica quickly jumped in, her voice a touch sharper now. "That's convenient, Governor, but the optics." Abbott cut her off with a wave of his hand, leaning forward. "No, Jessica, this isn't about optics. This is about reality. And reality doesn't need your approval to be true." The studio fell into a momentary silence, broken only by the faint hum of the cameras. It was clear, Abbott had landed a clean, devastating hit. And Jessica knew it. Jessica leaned back, crossing her arms, trying to compose herself. But there was a flicker in her eyes, an unspoken acknowledgement that Abbott's last blow had landed deep. She shifted in her seat, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, Governor," she began, her tone now slower, measured, "even if everything you say is technically true, the way you present yourself, the tone, the words you choose, makes you sound heartless. Leaders should inspire compassion, not fear." Abbott tilted his head, almost amused. "Heartless? Jessica, I have more compassion than you could imagine. But I refuse to confuse compassion with chaos. There's nothing compassionate about allowing human trafficking to flourish. There's nothing compassionate about watching women and children get exploited by cartels. You talk about kindness, but what you're selling is neglect wrapped in a nice bow." The audience erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs. A cameraman instinctively zoomed in on Jessica's face again, her smile now frozen, like a statue trying not to crack. Abbott leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to draw the entire room in. "You sit here in this studio, protected, paid, and comfortable, judging decisions you've never had to make. But when the border towns are drowning, when the sheriffs are calling me at midnight begging for more resources, I don't have the luxury of sitting back and moralizing from a safe distance. I have to act. And that action will upset people like you. I'm fine with that." Jessica's eyebrows arched. "So you're saying criticism doesn't matter to you?" Abbott smirked. "Criticism matters when it comes from people who understand the problem. Not when it's from someone whose knowledge of the border comes from headlines and opinion columns." That line sent a shockwave through the audience. Several people laughed out loud, others gasped. Jessica's jaw tightened. She had underestimated Abbott's ability to play offense without ever raising his voice. Trying to regain footing, she said, "Well, the polls." Abbott interrupted without hesitation. "The polls? Jessica, I don't lead by polls. If I did, nothing would ever get done. Leadership isn't about chasing approval, it's about making the hard calls when no one else will. The audience clapped again, louder this time. Then Abbott turned directly toward the camera, his voice unwavering. To the people watching at home, ask yourself this: do you want leaders who manage appearances, or leaders who solve problems? Because one gets you good press, the other gets you real results. Jessica stayed silent. For the first time that night, she didn't have a comeback ready. And the cameras captured every second of it. The studio felt heavier now, as if the air itself had thickened after Abbott's last statement. The audience leaned forward, sensing the conversation had shifted into a territory where there was no turning back. Jessica, still searching for a foothold, adjusted the papers in front of her, stalling, buying herself a few seconds to think. She finally leaned toward the microphone, her voice calmer but dripping with accusation. You know, Governor, a lot of people believe your so-called decisive leadership is just political theater. You send buses of migrants to northern cities, not because it helps them, but because it scores you points with your base. That's not problem-solving, that's showboating. Abbott didn't even blink. Jessica, you call it political theater. I call it exposing hypocrisy. The same mayors and governors who call Texas policies cruel suddenly find it impossible to handle a fraction of the numbers we deal with every single day. It's not theater, it's a mirror. And they don't like what they see. A low rumble of applause spread through the audience. Some viewers at home were probably already clipping the exchange for social media. Jessica shot back, "You're playing with human lives to make a point." Abbott's tone hardened, not louder, just sharper. And what do you think's happening at the border, Jessica? Every day, human lives are being played with. By cartels, by traffickers, by criminals who know Washington won't enforce the law. You can sit here and criticize my methods, but at least I'm confronting the problem head-on instead of pretending it doesn't exist. She tried to counter, but the humanitarian. Abbott cut in, leaning forward now. Let me ask you something, Jessica. Have you ever been to Eagle Pass at 2 a.m.? Have you ever stood on the Rio Grande while Border Patrol pulls a toddler out of the water, half-conscious, because smugglers pushed him in to distract agents? You haven't. And until you do, maybe you shouldn't tell me what humanitarian looks like. The crowd reacted audibly, gasps, murmurs, a few shouts of approval. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The sting of that moment was visible. It wasn't just a rhetorical hit, it was a personal one. Abbott straightened his jacket and delivered the kind of line that sticks in headlines. You talk about morality like it's a slogan, Jessica. But in Texas, morality is measured in lives saved, not in how nice your policies sound in a press release. Jessica inhaled sharply, but she didn't speak. She knew the cameras were on her, and any defensive reaction would be replayed in slow motion across every conservative media outlet by morning. Abbott, sensing victory, added one last twist of the knife. I'm not here to win your approval. I'm here to protect Texans. And if that offends you, you might want to ask yourself why. Silence. The studio lights seemed brighter. The tension had reached its breaking point, and Jessica's expression, half smile, half scowl, told everyone watching that she had no way out without losing more ground. The moderator shifted in his seat, clearly aware the temperature in the room had risen beyond anything the producers expected. He tried to interject, something about moving to the next segment, but Abbott didn't give him the opening. He kept his eyes locked on Jessica, voice steady but full of finality. You see, Jessica, you keep calling me names, immigrant enemy, political showman. But every time I push back, you avoid the actual facts. You've turned this conversation into an emotional performance, because deep down, you know if we strip away the theatrics, the numbers aren't on your side. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but Abbott wasn't done. Last year alone, Texas law enforcement apprehended over 400,000 illegal crossers. That's more than the population of Miami. Tell me, do you think Florida could handle that without making changes? Without taking a stand? Jessica hesitated, too long. The pause was deadly. The audience picked up on it instantly. Abbott leaned in just slightly, enough to show he wasn't about to back off. You accuse me of being cruel. But what's crueler, stopping dangerous crossings, or turning a blind eye while fentanyl pours across the border, killing thousands of Americans in cities you claim to care about? A low rumble of agreement swept through the studio. The cameras caught a few audience members nodding, others whispering to each other. Jessica shifted in her seat again, her hand instinctively straightening her notes, anything to occupy her hands while she searched for a comeback. She tried one last angle, her voice carefully measured. Governor, the way you talk about this issue alienates millions of people. You're dividing the country. Abbott smiled faintly, but it wasn't a warm smile, it was the kind that said the debate was already over. Sometimes division is what happens when truth meets denial. I'd rather stand on the side of truth and let the chips fall where they may. That line hit like a hammer. The moderator finally managed to step in, thanking both guests for their passionate discussion, but everyone watching knew Abbott had landed the last, and most damaging, blow. As the camera zoomed out, Jessica kept her smile, but it was thin, almost brittle. Abbott, on the other hand, looked calm, almost relaxed, as if he'd just done exactly what he came to do. On social media, the clips would spread within minutes. The freeze frame of Abbott leaning in, delivering that last line, would be shared alongside captions like, "Abbott ends the debate in one sentence," and "Tarlov speechless." By the time the credits rolled, the story was no longer about immigration policy, it was about how a governor turned the tables on one of his loudest critics, live, without ever raising his voice. It wasn't just a political win, it was a media moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and dissected for weeks. And Abbott knew exactly what he'd done. Tonight, we didn't just have a debate, we had a collision between political theater and cold, hard reality. Jessica Tarlov came armed with labels, soundbites, and rehearsed outrage. Governor Abbott came armed with facts, numbers, and an unwavering conviction to protect the people he serves. In the end, the difference was clear: one side wanted to score points, the other wanted to make a point. And when Abbott delivered that final line, "Sometimes division is what happens when truth meets denial," you could feel the air leave the room. That's not just a mic drop. That's a reminder that leadership isn't about making everyone comfortable, it's about standing firm when the stakes couldn't be higher. Whether you agree or not, one thing is certain: Greg Abbott didn't just defend his record tonight, he owned the stage.